How do you make something taste bright and citrusy when there isn't a lemon or an orange anywhere in the house? In the summer of 1961, a girl named Verna Ruth Boykins sat on an overturned bucket in her grandmother's kitchen in Selma, Alabama, watching a jar of apple cider vinegar get poured into a bowl of sugar and eggs. There wasn't a lemon in the house, and there hadn't been a lemon in that house in weeks. But by the time that pie came out of the oven, sliced thin and dusted with a little sugar on top, nobody at that table could tell the difference. Verna Ruth would remember that trick for the rest of her life, long after lemons stopped being anything close to a luxury in her own kitchen. That's the thing about the desserts on this list. They didn't come from a bakery, and half of them didn't come from a written recipe at all. They came from a grandmother's hands, a pinch of this, a splash of that, and a memory of how her own mother used to make it. Before we're through, you'll hear about a candy pulled by hand in the back pews of a Sunday church service, a cake built on burnt sugar instead of chocolate, and a dessert made from the one part of the fruit everybody else was throwing away. My name is Uncle Elijah, and today we're not talking about survival meals. We're talking about the sweet side of that same history. 10 desserts that fed generations of black families and mostly disappeared from modern kitchens. Here they are, starting with the one you've probably heard of but never actually seen made. Number 10. Tea cakes. Not a cake at all, really. A soft, slightly crumbly sugar cookie, rolled thick, cut by hand, and baked just until the edges turned the faintest gold. Tea cakes trace back to kitchens of enslaved cooks working with the barest pantry. Flour, sugar, butter or lard, an egg if there was one to spare, and whatever spice was on hand, usually nutmeg or a little vanilla. Over the generations that followed, this dessert traveled with black families out of the rural South and into cities like Chicago and Detroit during the Great Migration, picking up small regional twists along the way. A little more cinnamon here, a little more lemon zest there, but never losing its basic shape. Every grandmother's version tasted slightly different, and every grandchild who grew up on them will tell you, without hesitation, that their grandmother's version was the only one that counted. Making a proper batch usually meant standing at the counter for the better part of an afternoon, rolling and cutting dozens at a time, because a good batch never stayed in the cookie jar for long once the family caught the smell coming from the kitchen. Number 9. Vinegar pie. Sometimes called desperation pie, sometimes called pantry pie. This dessert solved a very specific problem. How do you make something taste bright and citrusy when there isn't a lemon or an orange anywhere in the house? The answer was a splash of apple cider vinegar stirred into a custard of eggs, sugar, and melted butter, baked into a flaky crust until the center barely wobbled. The vinegar didn't make the pie sour. It mimicked the tang of real fruit closely enough that most people at the table never guessed the truth. This recipe leaned hardest on black households during the Great Depression, when store-bought fruit was a luxury most families simply couldn't justify, but versions of it existed even earlier than that. Proof that resourcefulness in the kitchen didn't start or end with any single decade. Getting the balance right took a careful hand, because too much vinegar tipped the whole pie sharp and unpleasant, while too little left it tasting flat and unfinished. Number 8. Burnt sugar cake. Long before chocolate cake became the default birthday dessert in most American homes, black bakers across the South were building cakes around a different flavor entirely. Sugar, deliberately cooked past caramelization until it turned dark, bitter, and deeply aromatic, then worked into both the cake batter and a matching frosting. This wasn't a shortcut dessert. It took patience and a careful eye, because sugar can go from perfectly caramelized to burnt and bitter in a matter of seconds. Burnt sugar cake is widely considered the direct ancestor of the caramel cake that later became a signature of Southern black baking, and in many families, it was reserved for the biggest occasions of the year. The cake that told everyone in the room something important was being celebrated. Now, it's worth pausing on something that runs underneath almost every dessert on this list. Sugar itself carries a brutal history in the American South. It was one of the very crops that enslaved people were forced to cultivate under conditions almost too harsh to describe, on plantations built entirely around its production. And yet, in the generations that followed emancipation, black cooks took that same ingredient and transformed it into something joyful. Cakes, candies, and pies built with skill, patience, and genuine pride. That's not a small irony. It's the through line of this entire list. The same hands that were once forced to produce sugar under bondage later chose, freely, to turn it into celebration. Every cake, candy, and pie on this list was, in its own quiet way, an act of reclaiming something that had once been taken by force and turning it into something given willingly at a family table, out of love instead of obligation. Keep that in mind as we move further down this list. Number 7, molasses pull candy. On any given Sunday in the early 20th century, you might find this candy being made in the back pews or rec rooms of a black church, right alongside the sermon and the singing. Molasses and sugar were boiled together until thick, then poured out to cool just enough to handle, at which point it got pulled. Literally stretched and folded, again and again, between buttered hands, until the dark syrup turned pale gold and developed a light, chewy, almost taffy-like texture. It was a communal activity as much as a recipe, usually made in groups, with children roped in to help with the pulling. Almost nobody makes it today, and almost nobody sells it in a store. It survived entirely through people who were willing to stand there and pull it by hand. Timing mattered more than almost anything else in the process, because the syrup had to cool just enough to handle without burning fingers, but not so much that it hardened before the pulling ever really began. Number 6, watermelon rind preserves. After emancipation, watermelon carried a complicated symbolism for Black Americans. Grown, sold, and eaten with pride as a marker of independence, even as it was cruelly caricatured elsewhere. But practically speaking, a watermelon rind was too valuable to throw away. Peeled, cubed, and simmered for hours in a syrup of sugar, cinnamon, and clove, the tough white rind transformed into something translucent, sweet, and slightly spiced, canned in jars and pulled out through the winter months when fresh fruit was nowhere to be found. It turned a part of the fruit most people discarded without a second thought into a dessert that could sit on a pantry shelf for months, waiting for the moment it was needed. Number 5, persimmon pudding. Wild persimmons grow across much of the rural South, ripening late in the fall after the first hard frost. Pick one too early, and its bitterness will turn your whole mouth inside out. Families who knew exactly when to gather them mashed the ripe pulp into a batter with flour, sugar, and warm spices, baked low and slow until it set into something dense, moist, and almost pudding-like in texture. This dessert depended entirely on a specific kind of inherited knowledge, knowing which trees to check and exactly which week of late fall the fruit would finally be ready. The kind of knowledge that rarely gets written down and mostly just disappears once nobody's left to pass it on. A single bite of an underripe persimmon was usually enough to teach a child that lesson for life, which meant this particular skill got handed down early and never really needed repeating. Number 4, egg custard pie. About as plain as a dessert can sound on paper. Eggs, sugar, milk, a little nutmeg grated over the top, baked into a single crust. And yet it became one of the most reliable desserts in Black households for most of the 20th century, specifically because it needed almost nothing a family didn't already have on hand. No fresh fruit required, no complicated technique, just a working oven and a few eggs from the chickens out back. It showed up at funerals, at Sunday dinners, and on random Tuesday nights for no occasion at all, because it never asked much of the person making it, and it never let anyone down. Number 3, sweet potato cobbler. Distinct from sweet potato pie, this version skipped the custard filling entirely and instead layered thin sliced sweet potatoes with butter, sugar, and warm spices under a biscuit-like crust, baked until the potatoes went soft and the top turned deep golden brown. Sweet potatoes stored well through the winter without refrigeration, which made this dessert available at a time of year when almost nothing else fresh was left in the garden. It's a dish that leaned on abundance rather than scarcity. Sweet potatoes were one of the few crops a family could genuinely count on having plenty of. And it shows in just how generously this cobbler was built, layer after layer, meant to feed a crowd. Number 2, fried apple hand pies. Dried apples, rehydrated and cooked down with sugar and cinnamon into a thick, jammy filling, folded into a half moon of dough and fried in hot fat until the crust turned deeply golden and blistered. Because the apples were dried rather than fresh, this dessert could be made any time of year, long after the actual apple harvest had ended, which made it a genuine year-round staple in a way that fresh fruit pies simply couldn't be. Small enough to eat with one hand, they traveled well in a lunch pail or a coat pocket, turning a dessert into something that could survive an entire workday in someone's pocket before finally getting eaten. Number 1, not a cake, not a pie, not even something that requires an oven at all. Ambrosia, cold fruit salad, usually built from canned mandarin oranges, canned pineapple, shredded coconut, marshmallows, and a spoonful of sour cream or whipped topping, folded together and chilled until serving. It sounds almost too simple to earn the top spot on this list, and that's exactly why it belongs there. Ambrosia showed up at nearly every black church potluck, family reunion, and holiday table across the country for most of the 20th century, precisely because it took almost no skill, almost no cooking, and almost no money. Just a handful of canned and dried ingredients stirred together in a bowl. I put it at number 1, not because it was the most impressive dessert these families made, but because more black households, in more decades, made this exact dish more often than anything else on this entire list. It was the dessert that showed up when nobody had time to bake, and it still showed up looking like somebody cared. So tell me, which of these did your grandmother actually make, and which one do you wish somebody in your family still made today? I read every comment, and half of what ends up in this journal comes straight from families who remember these desserts firsthand. If preserving this history matters to you, do something small about it. Because every dessert on this list says the same true thing. Joy doesn't require abundance. It only requires someone willing to turn what little they had into something worth gathering the whole family around. Somewhere out there, a version of one of these desserts is probably sitting written on an index card in a grandmother's handwriting, and it might just be worth asking to see it before that card is the only place it exists.